Hello, everybody. This is a webcast we're doing to talk about PCI DSS and everything it takes to get certified. Today with us, we have Managing Director at Risk 360, Christian White, and myself, Christian Hyatt. Christian, mind doing a quick intro?
Yeah, absolutely. So, like you said, I'm Christian White. I go by CW sometimes, but I oversee our compliance practice at Risk 360, and PCI is one of the service lines under that practice that I lead.
Excellent. So I know when a company is kind of thinking about their PCI journey, there's a lot to think about. So kind of the goal for today's webcast is to talk about the framework and the background. So if this is your first time ever considering PCI, like where did it come from? Why are customers asking you for this? Talk a little bit about the framework from an overview perspective, provide some tips along the way, and then also give a big picture view of the certification process, some of the common pitfalls that organizations see as they're doing a PCI implementation, and then also get down into the nitty gritty of around timeline, efforts that your team can expect, and then at the end, CW, we're going to do some rapid fire Q&A and put you on the spot and see if you can answer stuff quickly.
Let's do it.
Awesome. So I know PCI is governed by the PCI Standards Council. Can you just talk a little bit about CW? Like, where did PCI come from? Why are organizations being asked about this? What's the background?
Yeah. So the background is the payment brands all have a vested interest in the security of the payment card ecosystem. So you can imagine brands like Visa and MasterCard, they want to protect the cardholder data wherever that data may live and wherever that data may traverse through the ecosystem of payments. And so they, along with the other payment brands, have put together the PCI Security Standards Council and gave them a mandate to create security frameworks and governance programs for helping to ensure the security of the ecosystem. So whether you're a merchant or a service provider or have some other role within the ecosystem, if you play in that space, you'll be subjected to the different security standards that are relevant to you.
Yeah, so I think from our clients, we see a couple use cases in terms of why clients are pursuing a PCI certification or a ROC and an AOC as it's called. One of those reasons is because, I'm a service provider and my customers are saying you have to be PCI compliant. So can you talk a little bit about that ecosystem? What's driving those requirements in terms of why are my customers and partners asking me to do this?
Yes, so as part of that mandate, the payment brands trying to protect cardholder data, there are requirements from those payment brands, both for banks, merchants, service providers. So if you're a merchant, you're going to be subjected to the PCI data security standard requirements based on your threshold. And each of the payment brands have different thresholds for level one compliance versus level two versus level three for a merchant. And then for service providers, whether you're a level one service provider versus level two, and they define what those thresholds are. And so, especially among service providers, what we've seen is that they're often being asked to be compliant because their customers need to be compliant. So if you're a merchant and need to be compliant with PCI DSS and you're relying upon some vendors to operate controls or requirements on your behalf, you also need to be PCI compliant. So if you take that, one or two steps further, especially for service providers, if you want to be competitive in the payment space, even if you're not subject to being level one compliant by virtue of what you're doing as part of the ecosystem, your clients want that assurance that you're complying with the PCI DSS and that you're level one certified and can speak to that. So that's kind of
Yep.
some of the drivers behind that.
Yeah, and I guess the bottom line is if you're a SaaS company and you facilitate the payment ecosystem in any way,
Yep.
um,
Mm-hmm.
and in all likelihood, you're going to have big customers that to get comfortable, they're going to want to see that you're PCI compliant. And I think for us, that's the most common use case is we have these SaaS companies that say, my biggest client really wants to see me be level one compliant. And that's because your big customers experiencing some pressure to manage their vendors and make sure they're PCI compliant. So thus, we have a whole ecosystem of retailers and merchants and now service providers becoming PCI compliant.
And then if you're,
So
and the other thing is if you're not being forced to do that by your partners and clients, then it's a marketing story too, to be able to be proactive and say, hey, I'm level 1 compliant. I've got my ROC and AOC, and I can demonstrate that I'm operating a PCI program as attested to by a third party.
yeah, absolutely. So that's some of the background, and now I want to kind of jump into the framework itself. So I guess the good thing about PCI is they provide the framework open to everyone. It's a framework that you can download. They have, uh, probably more thought leadership than almost any other certification body on like their approach and recommendations towards the various standards. But at least from our experience, no two clients are the same. Like there's always nuances into how an organization becomes PCI compliant, and sometimes those nuances aren't recognized until you're in the sub requirement buried in the requirements somewhere, and you get to that and you have to think through it. But at a high level, CW, could you just talk about the requirements? There's 12 requirements broken up into I think 6 kind of objective areas. Can you give us a quick overview of some of those?
Yeah, so I'll run through that. Like you said, there are 6 objective areas, and 12 requirements. So at a high level, the 12 requirements are as follow, and I'll abbreviate them so that I don't become too long-winded. But bottom line is requirement 1 is all about installing, maintaining firewalls to protect the network, to protect cardholder data. What that looks like in a cloud environment might be different than a traditional environment. So you're relying on network security groups, routing tables, things like that. Requirement 2 is basically change all your vendor defaults. For all your system components, make sure that you're not using the default accounts and passwords that came with the system component. Requirement 3 is all about protecting cardholder data at rest. Requirement 4 is protecting cardholder data in transit. So these are fundamental thoughts around security, and PCI is a great security framework outside of the fact that it is specifically tailored for the payment card industry. Requirement 5, have antivirus installed on all your system components. Requirement 6, SDLC, have secure development. Requirement 7 is all around restricting access. Requirement 8 is identity and authentication. So again, these are just basic fundamental blocking and tackling of security. And I appreciate PCI's framework for that reason, is it does get to the blocking and tackling of security, but goes to a little bit more of a technical depth than such as like a reporting framework, such as SOC 2. Requirement 9 is all about physical access, restricting that often for cloud companies, SaaS companies. They're relying on that third-party cloud service provider to operate those controls in their behalf. Requirement 10 is all about logging and monitoring. Requirement 11 is about assessments, such as vulnerability assessments, penetration testing. And then requirement 12, in my opinion, is a catch-all for security governance. So that's
Yep.
a quick rundown of all 12 of the requirements.
Yep. So thanks for that. And I want to talk about some of the nuances that come up. So one thing is, what are you going to get out of this to provide a customer? So if you're wondering that, there's 2 documents that you're going to get that I think there's some confusion. You're going to get something called an AOC, which is attestation of compliance. It's like a 1-pager saying that you are PCI compliant. That's what most organizations provide their customers when they have like diligence requests. The second thing you're going to get is called a ROC, or report on compliance, ROC. And this is like a 200-page document with every single requirement, the testing that we performed, who we talked to, what evidence we looked at, etc. Most organizations choose not to provide that to the public or to their customers because it's highly confidential information, although sometimes it is required. So if you're curious as to like the details of, what are the 100 things each one of these 12 requirements require, you can download that ROC or the ROC to see all of those different requirements. One thing I want to point out, CW, is I feel like there's a lot of nuance when it comes to the cloud in terms of how you comply with these things if you're not a traditional on-prem or not a traditional merchant. You're a service provider and you're an AWS, GCP, or Azure,
Yeah.
especially around like physical security and physical
Hmm.
access. So can you talk a little bit about like the shared responsibilities model for cloud service providers?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's a big one that comes up pretty much for all of our clients nowadays is, what things are my cloud service provider or providers doing on my behalf to where I can rely upon them to meet certain PCI requirements. And so something that we see the big cloud service providers do is provide these responsibility matrices that say, hey, based on the level of subscription, whether it's infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, these are the requirements that we're operating on your behalf. And so you as a service provider or merchant, you would want to get that attestation of compliance from your cloud service provider along with that responsibility matrix to understand at a granular requirement level, what are the things that I'm still responsible for versus the things that my cloud service provider is taken on for me.
Yeah, there's some thought in the marketplace that if I'm using AWS or one of the cloud service providers, that they're taking on all or most of the burden, and that's typically not the case.
Right.
The other thing to note that each cloud service provider has a different shared responsibilities model.
Mm-hmm.
So you may look at AWS or GCP or Azure's shared services model, and they accept certain responsibilities that are different from the other cloud service providers.
Right.
So this can be very complicated if you're a multi-cloud environment. So you operate across, one or more of those cloud service providers. So your approach might be different, and that's an important consideration. So that might be a good segue into talk about the certification process, CW. So our
Mm-hmm.
certification process, the process that we take all of our clients through, follow a four-step process. We do scoping, we do certification readiness, we give you an opportunity to remediate, and then we do the official certification. I would
Mm-hmm.
argue that the strategy around scoping might be the most important component of the program because you want to get that right to kind of limit your audit burden, but also maximize your security posture. So, can you talk a little bit about the process overall, but especially scoping and some of the considerations organizations should think about?
For sure. Yeah, I think you're right. Like the number one thing I always tell clients up front is you got to get scope right. And by extension, if you're using segmentation controls to reduce the scope of your cardholder data environment, we need to define those, what those are and make sure that they're operating as intended. Um,
Yeah, can you talk about PCI's? Like they take a very hard stance on what
yes,
is in scope. So, can
right.
you talk a little bit about like why this even matters compared to other frameworks?
Yeah, so PCI stance is, they want to protect that cardholder data. And so what they consider in scope is anything that touches uh, anything that's part of that cardholder data environment and anything that touches it or could affect the security of it. So, for instance, if you have a corporate network and you are processing, transmitting, or storing cardholder data on that network, and you have not implemented any segmentation controls on that network, your entire network is in scope for PCI and would need to be compliant with all the PCI requirements. So that could be a huge burden, and maybe that's not how you intend it to be. And so often when we're doing a gap assessment or talking with clients about their scope, we say, is there opportunity to limit that scope, or by implementing segmentation controls to reduce what we need to consider for PCI. And there are different ways to segment your network. But bottom line is, if you can reduce the scope of your PCI environment and limit it to just those system components that process, transmit, or store cardholder data, or can affect the security of that environment, you're able to drastically reduce the scope of your compliance, and that does reduce the burden.
Yeah, we've seen things like, for example, an organization, all laptops become in scope because laptops could
Mm-hmm.
technically impact the security, or like you said,
Right.
the whole corporate network becomes in scope.
Mm-hmm.
And by implementing segmentation controls, so like for example, having a bastion host in a segmented zone, you can effectively take it from an entire corporate network down to a very specific scope, thus limiting audit efforts, applicability, and really has implications across the whole program. So that's one of the key things that we talk about. The other thing that we talk about is like just applicability of the different control objectives, because from time to time, a control objective might not be applicable. It could be a shared responsibility, or maybe because PCI was written in a very specific way, maybe there has to be compensating controls because you've architected your system in a certain way that's not exactly how PCI said you should do
Mm-hmm.
it, but it's managing the same risk. So you want to identify all of those things during scope. So scoping's first part. Assuming we get that right, we move on to readiness, remediation, and certification. So, CW, can you give us a quick tour of what that process looks like?
Yeah, so scoping to me, that's like the strategy piece. You want to get that right up front. If that's right up front, everything flows from that. And then when we get granular into like, all right, well, how do you implement segmentation controls? PCI has published a lot of pretty good guidance on that, and we'll talk about that a little bit at the end, I think, as far as resources. Um, but once we kind of level set on scope and segmentation, then the next step is really moving into that readiness piece where we're doing a gap assessment against the PCI requirements, understanding what's in place today, what's not, and then thinking through that remediation piece. Both timeline, effort estimation, resources, costs, and then different ways to meet the requirements. So that often is the biggest piece that can take the longest based on the company's priorities, and then how fast they can implement and remediate those identified gaps.
Excellent. So I guess that brings up a good question is like, how long does all this take? Because we have to do scoping. We're going to do a gap assessment, tell you all the things that are wrong. You're going to take that gap assessment, and you're going to go remediate those items. And then ultimately, we're going to validate remediation and do an official certification.
Mm-hmm.
So, CW, can you talk about just timeline on average? I know this is highly variable based on organizational complexity and the resources they have to execute against remediation and things like that. But can you talk in general what a company can expect?
Sure. I would give it, estimate 3 to 6 months. The gap assessment piece, the strategy piece, that stuff's pretty easy to do. It's always the remediation piece that is the longest. So 6 months is a good planning factor from, what is PCI to, we've remediated all the gaps and we're ready to complete our certification assessment and get our ROC and AOC. 6 months is probably a fair budgeting timeline if the company does already have a security program implemented. If not, and you're starting from scratch, this is your first compliance exercise, then it'll probably be longer than that. But I would say that 3 to 6 months is a fair timeline for companies that already have good security program governance, and this isn't their first rodeo around compliance.
Yeah, I especially think this is true if you're a SaaS provider. If you're doing like a business to business service through a SaaS platform, because the cloud technologies enable a lot of this, I think that 3 to 6 months is pretty feasible, especially if you're a highly motivated organization. If you're watching this and you're a retailer or a merchant and you have shops all over the country or something like that, there could be some nuances, of course, but our specialty is typically those SaaS service providers, and this timeline meshes with that. Um, so kind of moving on, I guess a natural question there is like, I know organizations are trying to do planning in terms of resources. How big of a distraction is this going to be for my team who has to take on this compliance burden? So thinking about that in two ways, I guess year one and remediation is probably a little bit different story than maintaining the program overall. So can you talk about what an organization might be able to expect that first year, and then maybe like what are the maintenance and audit burden on a go forward basis?
Sure. Yes, I mean, because PCI is trying to address security holistically, even though there are some roles and responsibilities that will have, I guess, more effort will be required from them. It still is an all hands on deck type of assessment. So, key roles such as database administrators, engineering, security, network and system administrators, security administrators. There's a lot of different roles that could be involved depending on how the company is set up. Now, obviously, if you're a smaller SaaS company, you might only have a few engineers and one person responsible for security. But in general, for each of those roles, we're going to want 4 to 6 hours to get through walkthroughs, observations, talk through strategy, and then the person or persons that are primarily responsible for the program, for them, getting through the gap assessment and planning that remediation timeline, you're looking at probably 40 to 60 hours, with help from your QSA. So I guess one thing to note is we Risk 360 is a QSA firm. We are security assessors that have been certified by the PCI DSS to conduct these level 1 assessments. So often we're not only doing the assessment, but also advising on the standard and different ways to meet the requirements. But I guess back to your question as far as typical efforts, overall for the team, you're probably looking at 120 hours.
Yeah, and can you talk about during that audit process, like what types of things are they going to be doing? For folks who've never been through an audit, like what can they expect? How would they interact with you? That kind of thing.
Yeah, so we'll typically kick off by doing walkthroughs for every requirement. We'll do a planning session with whoever's going to be responsible for the program, and we'll understand, all right, who's responsible for firewall configuration, who's responsible for database security and configuration. And we'll have meetings with each of those persons responsible for that, walk through the PCI requirements, observe configuration settings in real time, to validate that things are actually in place as described or as intended, or whether there are gaps there. In a non-COVID time, those are things that we're doing on site. Otherwise, they're things that we can also do remote through screen share. So there are a lot of meetings up front, and then it's a matter of remediation and then exchange of evidence for us to go ahead and inspect and validate that things are in place.
Excellent. So I want to move on to some rapid Q&A for some frequently asked questions. I think we addressed a lot of the ones that we talked about in advance. I'm going to throw you some curveballs as well. One question that comes up a lot is you have to engage an audit firm to do this kind of work. When you're engaging an audit firm, can you talk a little bit about like what am I looking for in a decent QSA, and then also like what can I expect in terms of costs from an audit firm?
Yep. So yeah, first you want to understand based on the level of compliance that you're trying to achieve, you may need a QSA involved. So if you want to achieve level 1 compliance where you're having a ROC done by an independent party, you'll need to make sure that you are engaging a QSA firm. What you should expect from that QSA is they should be able to tell you what their process is. Like, tell me tactically, how is this going to go? What level of involvement and advisory are you going to give me as part of that process? Are you just assessing me against the requirements, or is there any sort of implementation and advisory over, how to meet those requirements? Those are all fair questions. Additionally, how are we going to exchange information? Do you have a secure platform? Are we working out of Excel and email? All those are important things to get answers on up front.
Yeah, and I know some of the things that we do is like, for example, we focus almost exclusively on SaaS environments and cloud tech. So that might be a good question. If you're if you're a merchant, large retailer, you're going to want a QSA that has experience working with retailers and large merchants. If you're a SaaS company, you want someone with a deep cloud background that communicates like you and understands a tech company, that kind of thing. You also alluded to the evidence exchange thing. So one way a lot of organizations do this is they'll send you an Excel spreadsheet or a smart sheet or something that just has 200 requests, and then you're either uploading to Dropbox or emailing stuff back and forth with no clear way to do that. That creates a pretty terrible process, in my opinion. We have a platform called Phalanx that we use that is a GRC platform that we give to all of our clients to A, give them a bunch of free resources, and B, to really facilitate that audit interaction and provide some guidance. But if companies don't have something like that, to me, expect a lot more pain than is probably necessary.
Yep.
Um, Second question, CIB, is we alluded to this earlier, but
Mhm.
can you talk a little bit more about segmentation? Like, what are some common segmentation techniques? Where can I go to find
Mhm.
more resources about segmentation, that kind of thing?
Yeah. Um, so the idea behind segmentation is to um, cut off communication and anything that could impact security between your cardholder data environment and any untrusted networks. So there are ways to do that through firewall rules, access control lists, and PCI has got a pretty good paper on that, as well as we've got some resources that I think we'll be able to show in the notes as well, such as white papers. We've got one called How to Scope and Segment Your PCI Environment. PCI has one called Scoping and Segmentation Guidance. So those are really good resources to think through different ways that you can go about that. Whether it's those items I mentioned or purchasing some additional tools. But it really is a matter of strategy. And then when you think of the cloud, well, how am I going to segment my cloud environment? PCI does have some good guidance related to the cloud and also related to virtualization. So I guess one of the things you mentioned, assessing a QSA partner, do they have experience dealing with PCI in the cloud and using virtualization? Because the PCI DSS, as it currently in its version 3.2.1, is a little bit outdated. It doesn't really address a lot of the modern infrastructure, the modern tech stacks, especially for SaaS companies. And that's why PCI published that cloud guidance to help you think through what does this look like applied to the cloud. And like you mentioned, I mean, that's really our bread and butter and kind of where we focus our time.
Yep, I know they're coming out with version 4.0. Sometime this is currently May 2021, but
Mm-hmm.
so we're expecting that to come out anytime.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about so there when you're thinking about PCI and
Mm-hmm.
cost and things you have to do, there is the implementation piece of it. There is the certification, and I'll just say if anyone's wondering, certification to an audit firm is probably between 20 and 40K. It depends a ton on scope and complexity of the organization, but for most SaaS companies, they're probably in that realm. But can you talk about other requirements that if you're preparing a budget, preparing things that you have to do like pen testing, vulnerability scanning, stuff like that, like what should companies be thinking about that might be outside of their thought process when they're preparing a budget?
Yes. So vulnerability scanning is definitely one. There's a requirement to do quarterly internal vulnerability scanning, as well as quarterly external vulnerability scanning. Internal vulnerability scanning that can be done by an external resource or an internal resource as long as they have independence, so they're not operating the security controls that they would be assessing. Um, and then for the external vulnerability scanning, that has to be done by an ASV firm or an approved scanning vendor. And PCI lists the approved scanning vendors on their website. So that is an additional cost that would need to be budgeted. And then also there's a requirement for an annual external penetration test, internal penetration test. And then if you are using controls implemented to segment your environment, those segmentation controls for service providers would need to be tested every 6 months. So
Yep.
those are all additional cost considerations that you would need to think through. The benefit of Risk 360 would be, we do all those things. So we're a full service provider for all that. And often we're able to get those to our clients at a price point by bundling those, which make a lot of sense. But those
Yep.
are the big brush movements on costs for PCI assessments.
Yeah, I mean, and just to recap, that's a lot of stuff. So you have the implementation, the certification, and to maintain that program, you have to do quarterly internal vulnerability scans, quarterly external vulnerability scans by an approved scanning vendor, an annual penetration test, internal and external, and then if you're using segmentation, you have to have your segmentation validated every 6 months. So
Yep.
that's a whole host of activities that sometimes organizations aren't preparing for when they're thinking about their journey.
Yep.
Great. I think that's a great group of questions as far as our Q&A that we didn't address before. I do want to point out some free resources that people can take advantage of that are both internal to Risk 360 or the Standards Council have released. So first of all, Risk 360 has a whole learning center that we've kind of outlined the basics of PCI. We have videos like this around PCI. We have white papers that address some of the nuances of PCI. We've tried to take some of the complexity and put it into human readable format. So that's great. We also have a blog that you can search for PCI topics that we write about. Also, if you engage with 360, we have a platform. I mentioned Phalanx GRC earlier, that within that platform, we have videos, we have guidance, we have policy templates that are available for our clients to use. Also, detailed guidance on every single requirement, again, when we're trying to put that in human readable format. I'll share some links in this video description if you're watching this on YouTube or something where you can download those information on those. And then also the PCI Standards Council is a great resource. CW, can you talk a little bit about some of the resources that PCI puts out?
Yeah, so if you go to the PCI documents library on the PCI SSC website, like I said, the things that I would take a look at if you're new to PCI is the scoping and segmentation guidance, the standard itself, the cloud guidance, virtualization guidance, the penetration testing guidance. Those are all really good documents that will give you a once over the world and ways to think about this. So those would be things I'd recommend. One thing I'll mention that we put together that I think is particularly helpful is we put together a punch list, which is on our blog, as well as we have it available for download, is the recurring compliance activities associated with PCI. So there's a host of activities that need to be done on a recurring basis, such as those quarterly vulnerability scans, such as annual penetration testing, such as daily log reviews, things like that. And so having that punch list, in a format where you can assign those to different owners and then periodically check up on them throughout the year, just to make sure that those controls continue to be operated so that there's no gap in coverage. Those are important, and those are some of the things that if you don't track, often trip companies up.
Yeah, absolutely. We have that same thing. We have something called Compliance Calendar and Phalanx where you can assign those out and sync it to your calendar if you want to. Maybe I'll do a quick image of that in the video. But excellent, CW. I appreciate you sharing your knowledge. If you're watching this and you enjoy these kind of videos, or you're considering other security and compliance frameworks, you can check out our YouTube channel. Just go to YouTube and search Risk 360. We have everything broken up into playlists. So if you're considering ISO 27001, PCI, SOC 2, GDPR, privacy, pretty much any alphabet soup of different regulatory and compliance frameworks you can think about as related to security or privacy. We have a whole video series on those, and we're constantly putting more videos out. So if that's something that interests you and it helps you on your educational journey, please check out our YouTube channel, or you can check out our learning center on the website, thisrisk360.com/learn, and our blog, and there's tons of free resources available to you all as you're learning. So thank you for watching. Thank you, CW, for sharing your knowledge.
Absolutely. Thank you.